Hello again everyone, today I just want to share to you the disaster of pushing the wrong pawn in the endgames. As we all know, there are rules to when we have to push pawns and when we have to retain them. And these few games I got from the recently concluded Super Bad Chess Classic, and I thought it's interesting that there are recurring themes as to how these players lost. And that is by pushing the wrong pawns in the endgame, or in the middle game at least. Now in this game we got from Nepomniachtchi first of all holding black, versus Wesley So holding white from the round 4. To give a bit of context, Nepomniachtchi actually plays the kind of Catalan that he plays in the World Championship match against Carlsen, where he's down a pawn in the entire game. Therefore, in this kind of endgame, he's just down a pawn. And one must say that he defended the game quite nicely. He is able to bring the structure to the 4-on-3 on the king side. This is actually known as a drawn endgame. Nobody could actually make an advance, make a progress, just because how stuck configuration is for black and white. As you can see here, white can choose to play pawn to f4, pawn to g4, pawn to e4 in the next few moves, but there's always going to be a perpetual check somewhere on the second rank when the king is too exposed. Not going to go into that, but we're just going to see how Nepomniachtchi actually defends this. He defends this quite nicely, moving queen about, shuffling about. And after queen to f3 though, he would still choose to shuffle about the queen to, let's say, f6, queen to e7, queen e5, queen to c5, all viable options. All queen moves, I think, that does not hang the queen immediately will have result in a more stable position, and hence he'll be able to draw pretty quickly. Instead, in this position, plays pawn to g6. Now this is the beginning of a disaster, because this is actually not necessary to play. White obviously takes the pawn, and notice that he can't take with the f-pawn because there's going to be a checkmate very soon. Bishop to e6 check, and no matter where you go, there's going to be a checkmate. King h8, of course, loses the bishop check, and this is going to be mate right here on g8. And if he goes to h7, let's say there's going to be the same check on f7, and he's going to lose by the same checkmate. And so that's no good. Taking with the queen is then forced, but as you can see, the pawn now is split on h6 and f7. This is not ideal endgame that you want to defend against a grandmaster. I mean, your drawing chances is just lessened over here. You're down a pawn still, and you're worsening your pawn structure in the end of the day. White can opt for pushing the pawn to e4, pushing the pawn g4, queen f4, target a pawn h6 forever. And again, this pawn f7 is pretty weak. g5 is open for an attack. As we advance, you'll see how weak the position for Nepomniachtchi is and how easy it is to make a blunder. In this position, Nepomniachtchi trades queens, decides to just trade queens with white, but of course the position is so weak for Nepomniachtchi. Wesley So just refused the exchange, and after queen to b7, h2, and all these moves, we can just move forward. Nepomniachtchi plays a 2-move blunder that ends the game pretty quickly. The first one is bishop to d4, trapping the bishop on this diagonal so that now it cannot come back, but also because of that, white has planned a pawn to e6. We have to take, we can take with the queen with check, and all the light squares and the dark squares will be too exposed. This will not happen if the pawn is on g7. The king could have high on the dark squares and all would be pretty fine. Now the plan on e6 is quite strong, that black could not really ignore that. He plays queen to g6, but this actually is still a blunder. But bishop takes on h7. This is a check, rather a cruel check, because again the king can't take on f7. There's a queen to c4 check, and queen takes d4. But even though if queen takes f7 right here, we still play queen to g4 check, and we picked up the bishop on d4. A nice geometrical setup right here that allows white to win the bishop on d4 due to the fast mistake that he plays with the bishop coming to d4. And so this will not happen again if the pawn were to be on g7 and the g file is then closed. The drawing chances is close to 100%, at least for grandmasters to play. It is close to 100%. So that's the first game. Again, here black could have chose to play queen f6 and any queen move would have been fine. Instead plays g6 and losing the game in the end of the day. The second game is played by Linnea Dominguez and Levon Aronian. Linnea again is down a pawn in this position, but does play knight to d4, which is somewhat an active move. The knight can be moved to c6, b5, e2, f4. There's some potential over here, right? Some flexibility, and after bishop to c5, could have continued to play knight to e2, where it's going to be brought to f4. At least I think it's going to be attacking g6 constantly, which is pretty cool. Instead, this position plays pawn to f4, which is a blunder, and a blunder that can end the game rather immediately. Now, principally speaking, you don't play a move such as pushing the pawn on the king side, especially when you're down a pawn, and even after pushing the pawn, you won't have an attack. Just imagine f5 over here, right? For white, there won't be an attack that is sufficient to checkmate black, and so if principally you don't just push your pawns carelessly like this. But the most important factor in this position is that now the knight can't jump to f4 no more, and so after rook to d8, the knight is forced back then to go to f3. It can go to e2, but again, there's just no square for f4, and the d4 square is now controlled by the rook and the bishop, and so e2 is bad square to go to at least. Knight to f3 then is forced, but from here on out, white is going nowhere. The fact that you place pawn to f4 will allow rook to d2 at any moment, and so the knight is pretty much stuck here protecting on f3, protecting d2 square from infiltration. Levon plays king g7, and after f5, again there's no attack on the king side, and queen to g6, just threatening exchange queen, being up a pawn, the endgame with the somewhat advanced pawn on b4, that's going to be advantageous for black. Dominguez traded the queens and placed rook to e2, but after rook to d3, now the pressure is real. The king can just be brought to f5 and g4, and after that, pawn to f5, pawn to f4, that's just going to be constantly threatening white to have a zugzwang over here. Moreover, the knight, if it's attacked by the king and the rook, it cannot be protected by rook to f2 or rook to e3. And when you trade the rook, let's say with rook to d2, I can just ignore, it doesn't really matter with rook to e3. But to show you something, even after rook to d2 and knight to d2, this would still be a losing position for white, because of the king f5 and king g4, white's king is too passive. And even after this position, let's say with knight to c4 as a random move, king to g4, this will prove too much for Dominguez. Black can just push on bishop to d4 to e5, attack g3. White will have to move several times to attack some pawns. For example, knight to b2. Let's say we can play bishop to d4. That's possible. Knight to d3, attacking a pawn, we can protect with c5. Knight to f4, then we play bishop to e5, threatening to take twice on f4. That's possible. Knight to d5, finally attacking some pawns, but then bishop to g3 plus bishop to h4 plus pushing the pawn to victory is something that Levon Aronian will plan to do. And in this position instead, place knight to e1 instead, attacking the rook. The rook moves to c3, but after rook to c2 and exchanging, we have the same endgame where black's just trying to push on the queen side with his pawns, majority on the queen side, and white is going to be stuck on the king side, protecting or attacking the pawn that is useless. In this position, after pawn c3 and pawn c2, Dominguez just resigned. Nothing to play for. The pawn coming to c1 is next. White has sacrificed to prevent queening, but then black just too soon take up all the pawns on the queen side and promote the second one. And so that's the second game. Just about a week ago, Firouzja has the opportunities to bring down the former wall number 2 in what looks like a very clear endgame win for black. He has 3 pawns on the queen side that if he push on the queen side, he'll be bringing one of the pawns to a queen, because clearly white is naked on the queen side. It'll be hard or near impossible to stop the pawns from pushing forwards down the board and making themselves a queen. And credit to Aronian, he exchanges off the rook to get his ideal setup to as few as pieces possible so they can maximize the chances of drawing. The goal for Aronian will be taking the pawn on f6 and e7, pushing the pawns forward to get himself a queen as well. Well, black will be simple. Push his queen side pawns with the help of other pieces so they basically can promote themselves to a queen. In this position, f5, so that it makes it difficult for Aronian to take the pawn on the f-file. King to c2, of course, has to stop the pawn on the queen side as well, trying to stop the pawn. Pawn to a4 is pushing forward. Since it's still protected, pawn to a3 perhaps is next. Knight to a6, attacking the pawn f5. We see knight to c4. Next, we play pawn to a3. Again, if white recklessly take the pawn on f5, thinking that they can just push the pawn like this, then pawn to a3 is just a sorry move for white. The thing is, you can play king to b3. This is seemingly defending the a2 square, attacking the c4 square as well. However, here it just blunders a4 with knight to d2. Knight takes f3 is next, and bishop is still protecting the pawn. This position is clearly lost for white. And so white doesn't do that, and he just plays bishop to e2. Firstly attacking the knight, so that the pawn to a3, bishop c4. This protects the square on a2. Knight to d6 is played here by Firouzja, coming to e4, which attacks f2 square permanently. So bishop to d3 is played to prevent that. After knight to e4, he quickly chopped that off, and so he realizes he has the optimal setup to draw here. But still, it's practically impossible due to black having 3 pawns on the queen side and king coming to help to basically try to smother white on the queen side. White continues, knight to g8, knight to h6, and successfully takes the pawn on h7, but black doesn't really care. He just pushed the pawns on the queen side, and not the pawn to b3, king to b2, bishop to b4. Now it seems pretty clear. King to b6, king b5, king c4. Any of these moves and playing on the queen side to smother white is pretty cool. Instead, in this position, plays pawn to c5 after knight takes on e4. In this position, if you can see, as we talk about as well, king to b6 will be a good move, king to a5, bishop to somewhere, let's say c5, e7, f8, to then bring the king to b4, pawn c5, pawn to c4, pawn to c3, smother white king. That will be the plan for black to go to. After all, the bishop looks at the f8 diagonal, and so f5, f-pawn push won't be enough for white to actually draw the game, because it is possible for him to get a queen. The hh square is also a dark square. By playing pawn to c5, this actually allows knight to c3, also blocks the way for the bishop to come back. The knight to c3 also attacks the pawn on a4, and so it is almost forced for black to just take on c3. But now it's worse. The black bishop isn't even looking at the hh square anymore and f8 square, and so getting a queen for white is not so impossible right now. King to b6 can be played by black to still support the pawn, but again, as we talk about, white is just too fast over here. King to b5, f6, and in 2 moves he'll be queening. And so black has to be careful. He's going to be the one who is defending his position rather. The correct move in this position seems to be pawn to c4, where let's say after king to d4, to support the pawn from promoting, we play pawn to b2 and pawn to b1. So this is no good for white. He can play pawn to f5, but black can make it in time with king to d6, protecting the pawn from promotion. White then has to play king to d2 as well to protect him from, having any problem with the pawns. But essentially, we're just not going to go too deep into the pawn endgames. Just know that Firouzja just blundered. In the end of the day, he has, a queen, but his opponent also makes his queen prior easily. And after king takes a4, b2, there's a perpetual check. Then no matter where the king goes, there's going to be a check. And even in this position, plays queen takes b2. Kind of a savage move, because after queen takes on b2, that's a stalemate. The Vonoronian miraculously saves this game. And Alireza Firouzja must be kicking himself for playing pawn to c5 in this position, allowing knight to c3, and also closing down the bishop's pathway back to f8, forcing the bishop to take on c3 as well. The correct move again by Alireza Firouzja is king to b6, where after knight to c3 there is king to a5. Everybody is protected, but after knight to b1, let's say, to guard the square on a3. But again, as we discussed, bishop to e7 is pretty much enough to win the game. After king to b4, c5, c4, c3, it's just going to be kaput for the white side. The final game that we're going to see today is from Alireza Firouzja and Maxim Vachier-Lagrave. In this position, Maxim moves his knight back to f6, to being attacked, of course, by the pawn on e4, and Firouzja just blunders away with pawn to e5. Now the pawn to e5 moves attack the knight on f6, protect the knight on d6 to allow rook to c7, and takes on f7. This is a fine move to play for white. However, Alireza actually forgot that it's a counterplay of knight to g4 attacking the pawn on e5 at once. It is then possible to play pawn to f4, but that's just going to hang the rook, and that's not going to be very nice for white to play. So Alireza went for it and played rook to c7 anyway, and after knight to e5 and f4, Maxim Vachier-Lagrave plays a very nice move, and that is rook to d3, threatening to exchange the rook on d1. And if, let's say, white were to decline with rook to e1, well then the knight on d6 actually hangs. It doesn't really matter if white can play pawn takes on e5. We have rook to d2, rook to b6, this passed pawn still pushing. And so, in this position, white is kind of forced to take on d3, and after that takes on f7. But even after this, where material is now equal, black has a pass pawn that white's just going to have a trouble stopping with. Black just shows the simplest plan possible in the chess game, that is to push his own pass pawn to promotion, and after rook to d8 and knight to c4, trying to stop the b2 pawn, trying to stop the pawn from reaching b2. We do see b2 anyway, and even in this position, if rook to b7 is played, we can see like rook to c6, firstly attacking the knight, forcing the knight to do something. The knight has no better move to take the pawn on b2, but then this is going to be rook to c2 check, picking up the knight next move, and this is going to be better for black. In this case, Firouzja still plays knight to b2, and after rook to a7, knight to a4, we do see what's just down a 4 piece right here for a pawn, and in some 30 moves went on to win the game. We're just not going to go through all in depth, but just know that Maxime Vachier-Lagrave did win this endgame. Key is not to trade off the rook. If you trade off the rook, let's imagine that the rook is actually disappearing from this board, then this position will be somewhat a draw. These two pawns came in advance. The pawn on g6 also stuck here protecting the knight. This would be a draw for both sides. But by keeping the rook on the board, we can then create some chances for us to win. And in this position, when the king is brought close enough to smother white king and to take up more space of the king's escape, we can basically just trade off the rook. In this position, after rook takes e3 and king takes e3, the king still stuck. In this position, it will be a win. By the way, we'll not go too in-depth. This is too advanced of an endgame. We'll not go into that. Just know that Maxime Vachier-Lagrave went on to win just because our Aggressive Firouzja here plays pawn to e5, which is a clear blunder of a pawn. That's all for the video. If you learned something, please consider pressing the like button. That will help the channel a lot. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.